Hi everybody, my name is Matthew Poes with Poes Acoustics, and in this video I'm answering questions. So the question I got was, based on your comment for a single mixed LFE channel for small, medium, average home rooms, would you then say for movies that floor standing speakers aren't really giving any advantage at all? Some people say even though you're crossing at 80 hertz, it's of course not an immediate roll off, so you still gain some presence below that crossover point. Or do you find it just causes more complications to manage? I can't read today. I.e., no real advantage over good quality bookshelf speakers, not counting two-channel listening or discussing expensive in-wall and their advantages. I guess you may gain sensitivity SPL in some instances. Okay, so this is again kind of a big loaded question. Let's start with, based on your comment for a single mixed LFE channel for small medium rooms. We got to be clear here. There is bass management and there is LFE. LFE is a rendered channel that's used in Dolby and actually many other surround mixes. It's a bass effect channel. It's actually a full range channel, but the point is that it's used for low frequency effects. It is a mono channel. There is only one LFE channel. No matter how many subwoofers you have, there is only one LFE channel. Then there is bass management. That is where you take bass from other speakers and you fold it into another channel somewhere else. The way we have done it historically in home theaters is we fold all that bass that we don't think the other speakers can handle into the LFE channel's output. So you get LFE and it gets mixed with the bass management information. They get put together at the right levels and sent out to your subwoofer. Now, you could, in theory, again, most systems can't do this, but you could, in theory, have an LFE channel that goes to all the subwoofers, but then create something like quadrants, where the left front of the room's low frequency information goes to a subwoofer in the left front of the room. Denon and Marantz introduced a feature like this. I don't recommend doing that. And the reason I don't recommend doing that is that below around 150 hertz in the vast majority of rooms, that is going to create more problems than it solves. Bass is not all that directional, especially for movies and for pop music, where everything is summed to mono in the recording anyway. And you've got modal issues in the room, which are going to be much more problematic. And so you're adding some directionality that is probably not audible, but you're now adding also modal problems that can't be fixed. And now again, bass is summed to mono. Somebody else had made a point that, well, if that's true, then doesn't the directional bass thing not work, except for content where that's true? Yes, except for there's ways of EQing systems like with MSO that requires different EQ per subwoofer in order to get a nice smooth response across the seats that you can't do unless the signal is mono. So if you're going to do something like that, you can't do the directional bass, and I think the advantages of that outweigh the advantages of directional bass. When we're talking about, again, movies, because this is LFE, so there isn't much in the way of directional information in movies below those frequencies. And actually, we don't cross at 150 hertz typically. We cross at like 80 hertz, so we're really low. There is some directional bass information above about 50 or 60 hertz. And you should be looking at it as, we're very sensitive to this information between, let's say, 150 hertz and 300 hertz, roughly. Between 50 or 60 hertz and like 80 hertz, where it's there is sensitivity to it, but it's gone down. So there's an argument to be made that if you cross over at 80 hertz, that directional information has remained, and it's below that where we've sent a model where we're not that sensitive to it. There are still ways that this could be handled. Again, you could use lower crossover points. The LFE is still doing its thing. And so that's the LFE thing that I think got confused. Let's now talk about towers versus bookshelves. The answer is, it's not that simple. You could have a bookshelf speaker that is the term bookshelf typically just means like a monitor. So you could have a monitor that has extremely high output down to 80 hertz and can do reference levels down to 80 hertz just fine. And then you could have a tower speaker that actually can't. So in that scenario, that monitor would actually be a better speaker than that tower speaker is. So tower versus monitor versus bookshelf in and of itself is meaningless. There's a different set of issues to consider. For a given speaker company within a given line, as you move up, typically things get better. So one thing is, often the bookshelves cannot reproduce reference levels at 80 hertz. And a tower speaker, even though it's been optimized to produce bass all the way down to 20 or 25 hertz potentially, or even 30 hertz, and you're not going to let it do that, having those extra woofers means you've added significant dynamic range to the low end. So if the mid-range and the tweeter in that speaker can hit reference levels, now you don't need to worry about overloading the woofers. And often when you look at the rise in distortion, when you play at really loud levels, the rise in distortion is pretty significant at that low end. And so even though you're high passing it at 80 hertz, you're seeing significant rise in distortion, where with a tower, you're not going to get that. So probably I would recommend a tower in a scenario like that. That's not always true, as I said from where I started this conversation, but in many speaker systems, that would be true. The other thing is that often the mid-range in the tweeter is better, including often bookshelves are two-way, and a lot of companies have three-way towers. Now, a three-way is not always better than a two-way, but often they do have a bit more dynamic range. The directivity could be optimized better, especially if they're going for wider dispersion. They're less likely in many cases to have problems in the directivity. You know, the negatives of a three-way is you've got two places where you need to get a good directivity match. But the positives are you can often get more optimized wider dispersion with that because the drivers are smaller and they're kind of more properly sized for the range they cover. Because you can't have like a 3-inch woofer that has to do bass. But a 3-inch driver, for instance, or a 4-inch driver could be great for mid-range and could have the right directivity you need in that range. And then that lets you have a better sized tweeter that doesn't have to cross over quite as low. You can still get good directivity matching because now you've got a smaller mid-range, and it will perform better and beam later at higher frequencies. So depending on how they've designed it, it's totally possible that the tower speaker then has some advantages in that regard. So within companies like Polk Audio or Martin Logan, Definitive Technology, yeah, probably I'm going to recommend you go with a tower versus a bookshelf. Now, if you're making a comparison of, let's say, well, I could afford to buy I'm just going to make something up here, like I don't know, Bowers & Wilkins, whatever, tower speaker, or I could buy this bookshelf from, I don't know, Perlisten, let's say, since and I know that they make speakers that are the same price in the towers too, but let's just say you're looking at the lower end Bowers & Wilkins and you're looking at a high end Perlisten and you're saying, well, I can get the tower in the one and only the bookshelf in the other. Well, let me just tell you, that bookshelf very likely plays much, much louder than the Bowers & Wilkins tower can, just because none of the Bowers & Wilkins speakers play as loud as the Perlisten speakers do. And even their bookshelf plays extremely loud. So for things like movies where hitting reference levels is an important performance criteria for the system overall, the comparison between a bookshelf and a tower is a little bit silly. So it's more a within the line type comparison where this can matter, and not a across the board type thing. You know, even beyond the Perlistens, you can get into speakers like Ascendo, Gramani systems, etc. These are using pro drivers. Those monitors are relatively small and are going to have way more output than the biggest towers made by these other mainstream brands. So depending on the size of your room and what you're trying to do, and again, with reference level being an important requirement for a home theater, those other speakers, those small monitors, may actually be a much better choice than a large tower from a different company. But to the core of it, the reason why people are saying towers could still be a good idea is that the added woofers gives you more dynamic range, even in the in fact, quite a bit so in the upper bass range. And many bookshelves can't hit reference levels at 80 hertz. They will actually overload the woofers. And so adding in those extra woofers that are larger gives you enough headroom that it works better. Now, some people then take that a little too far and they lower the crossover points. I really don't recommend that because, again, as I say again, because I've mentioned this in other videos, the positioning of the left, center, right, and surround speakers is not the right position for subwoofers. And by that I mean it's not the right position for low-frequency sources for optimal performance in the room. You want your subwoofers to be your low-frequency source. They're more optimized for it. So you want to give them as much range to do that without being able to be heard. And heard is in the sense of directional. You don't want to detect them. So 80 hertz is a really good crossover point for that. It was chosen quite intentionally, and it's the point that I recommend. 70, 90 doesn't really matter. It's a small difference. But getting into the 50, 60 hertz, you've kind of lowered it too much, and I wouldn't do that. All right, so that's my video on that. I hope I answered that question and that was helpful. Thanks.